Recording the new batch 1934 World Cup France. So France are one of the four nations from Europe that made the trip to Uruguay back in 1930 to compete at the very first World Cup. This time around, France needed to qualify for the World Cup in 1934. Should mention France did have a great start to the 1930 World Cup where they won their first match against Mexico 4-1 and also scored the very first World Cup goal. Lucien Laurent scored in the Estadio Pocketus Stadium in Uruguay, Montevideo. Unfortunately, they lost their next two games to Chile and Argentina, which knocked them out. Okay, so in 1934 World Cup qualifiers, France was in the same group as Germany and Luxembourg. All three teams would have to play each other once, and the top two teams would go through. France beat Luxembourg 6-1 on the 15th of April 1934 in Luxembourg. That would knock out Luxembourg because prior to their game against France, they also lost to Germany 9-1. And because of these two wins, or two losses for Luxembourg, France and Germany didn't have to play each other, and both nations qualified for the World Cup. Germany for their first time and France for their second time. Alfred Aston became France's very first goal scorer at a World Cup qualifying match. Ernest Liberati also scored a goal for France in their game against Luxembourg, as I just mentioned. I also should mention this about Ernest Liberati, which I didn't mention in quite a lot of my videos regarding France at the World Cup and the 1930 World Cup. He was the very first player to have a assist at the World Cup because he assisted Lucien Laurent for his first goal. But who probably stole the show for France in their game against Luxembourg was Jean Nicolas, who scored 4 goals in that game for France, making him the first French player to score a hat-trick during qualifyings at a World Cup, and also the first to score a penalty as well. All right, that's how France was able to qualify for their second World Cup in 1934. And unlike the 1930 World Cup, this is a shorter trip for France since the World Cup in 1934 was hosted by Italy. There was a change of manager for the French team. George Kimpton, who happens to be English, he was the manager for the French team in 1934, taking over from Raoul Clédron. There's also a few players from the 1930 French team who competed at the 1934 World Cup. Emile Venati, Edmund Defleur, and Alex Depot, as well as the very first World Cup goal scorer, Lucien Laurent, all returned to the French team. The 1934 World Cup format is completely different from the 1931. Instead of group stages, this was a straight knockout tournament. So France couldn't afford to lose one game. France was one of the unseeded teams, and they came up against Austria, who was a seeded team, and Austria was making their debut at the World Cup in 1934. They competed at the Stadio Benito Mussolini, obviously named after Benito Mussolini at the time, and the stadium's in Turin. Eventually, the name of the stadium would be changed to the Stadio Olimpico Grande Torino, named after the very strong, fantastic Torino team back in the 1940s. They tragically lost their lives in 1949 in a plane crash. The game between Austria and France started at the same time as all the other matches in the round of 16. France, just like the previous World Cup, had a great start. Nicolas, who as mentioned earlier, scored 4 goals during qualifiers, got the first goal in this game for France in the 18th minute. Again, great start. But Austria, just a minute before the end of the first half, Schindler, Matthias Schindler became Austria's very first goal scorer at the World Cup, equalising for them. No more goals were scored in the second half, which took this game to extra time. Austria versus France being the very first game to go to extra time at the World Cup. Skill would give the lead for Austria in this game, scoring 3 minutes into extra time. And in the second half of extra time, Austria gets another goal. Bican scored, making it at that time 3-1 in extra time. For Austria, Jules Ververest did score a penalty for France 4 minutes before the end, but it was nothing more than a consolation for France. They were knocked out of the World Cup for a second time in the first phase. That penalty was also France's first penalty scored at the World Cup. Definitely a disappointing World Cup for France again. They had the lead and they lost to another debuting nation. This was a regular thing for all of the original 13 teams that did compete in 1934. They were all knocked out in the first round. France do host the next World Cup in 1938, which at that time was a controversial decision, especially for the nations in the Americas. I believe only one team, and that was Brazil from the Americas, did compete at the 1938 World Cup. France do perform better at that World Cup, finally getting past the first round, but do end up losing to Italy, who do go on to win in that World Cup. Mention a quick thing about Austria, who did defeat France. They do go on to reach in the semi-finals of the 1934 World Cup, the first of two semi-finals that they do make in their history. France do go on again to host another World Cup in 1998, where they do finally win for the first time and have reached another 3 finals since then, losing in 2006, but winning in 2018. And most recently, as recorded in this video, they were the runners-up of the 2022 World Cup. The UEFA Zone has started their World Cup qualifying campaign. They started back in March. However, France's group, since they are one of the groups of 4, they haven't started matches yet. They will start in September. France are in the same group as Ukraine, Iceland, and Azerbaijan. They are most likely favourites to qualify from their group. All right, that was my new batch 1934 France video. Thank you for watching, listening. I appreciate it as usual. And once again, bye.